So there are a few icons in our industry. I think you're going to meet one of them right now. Jim Routh has been kind of protecting infrastructure for quite some time. He's now with MassMutual. They're very lucky to have him. And I think we're even luckier to have him here this evening to share with us. So Jim, why don't you come on up, and we'll listen and learn.
So what I thought I would do is talk to you about the future of customer authentication. In order to do that, I'm going to talk about the history of passwords. Go figure. I was a history major as an undergrad. That may have something to do with it. I'm also going to share with you kind of the problems that we've had with passwords. Mickey and Ori kind of set the table. I'm going to give you a little bit more specifics. And I'm going to tell you what I'm doing about it. And I hope that that's a catalyst for what you think about passwords going forward, and maybe some options that you can consider. So historically, it turns out that even back when God spoke to Muhammad, Muhammad's information that was shared with scholars that followed was encrypted. Actually, there was a code used to encrypt some of that, and the actual writers of the Old Testament and the Quran used cryptography. So it goes back well before there was any notion of technology. And the first real cryptographer that was in a government office was in the Vatican. And this is back in the 16th century, and the Vatican basically collected taxes. So it was you know, essentially the government at the time. Got them into a few problems that caused them to flee Rome for 100 years and go to Avignon in France. The byproduct there is that we get Chateau de Neuf de Paf. Anybody heard of that wine? Chateau de Neuf de Paf? Yeah, it's Ted's a wine aficionado. He appreciates that. Chateau de Neuf de Paf means Chateau of the Pope. And that wouldn't have happened had we not moved the Vatican to Avignon. Now, I like wine more than I like security, so that's why we're having this conversation today. But I digress here. Maybe I should get back to what the subject at hand is. Yeah. So it turns out that the first trial where cryptography played a major role was with Mary, Queen of Scots. And unfortunately, she lost her head, and I mean that literally, because she was planning to overthrow Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth had a code breaker that cracked the communication that she was sharing for her coup, or planned coup, that was presented at trial, and she got the short end of the stick, so to speak. So, and you guys all know about the Enigma machine, and you saw the movie or read the book. So I didn't cover that, but in the 60s, in actually 1961, Fernando Corbato created the first password system, and it was for a file sharing system on a mainframe for MIT, and he wanted each individual owner of their folder to protect the contents of that folder, and he introduced the password. Now, he passed away a couple of years ago at the ripe old age of 90, and I think for 60 years, looking back at the password, it's served us well for enterprise security. It's been highly effective as a tool. The question is it going to remain to be effective for enterprise security going forward? Now, I'm going to answer that question for you and give you a sense. And it comes down to this. Shared secrets and passwords are based on one fundamental premise. Trust, and that you are the only one that knows your secret. Of course. My premise to you is that that's no longer valid today, because I can know credentials simply by engaging in the dark web to obtain credentials and then try those credentials out on any website and be successful. Now, I tried to think of a clever way to show this to you. And I don't think this is that clever, so I wasn't successful. But this is the way that I chose anyway. If you look at YouTube videos to teach you how to use Sentry MBA, And this particular video is a 28-minute video. It had 660 views about a year ago. And this is one example. Sentry MBA is a hacking tool. And what it does is it allows you to take credentials that you can harvest from the dark web and try them out, essentially spray them on any domain that you wish. Now, if you do that, you're going to get a 2% hit. For 10,000 credentials, I own 200 accounts. The criminals have figured out that it's much easier to use authentication credentials to get into a system versus exploiting vulnerabilities in the system. Because when you're in, you're trusted. Now, most of you here are staying in a hotel while you're at RSA. When you go into the hotel, you go in the lobby, you show the front desk your credit card and your driver's license, and they give you a card key. You go up to your room, you try the card key, and it works. That's an authentication event with a binary outcome. And that's what we've all learned that authentication has been. Now, if you look, I did a search on the web for all of these kinds of YouTube videos, and I came up with 317,000 YouTube videos to teach you how to use Sentry MBA. Now, you tell me, if somebody's making 28-minute videos, YouTube videos, on how to use a cracking tool, and they're doing 317,000 times. Do you think other people are using that? I think so, right? I think it's a pretty good indication that the obsolescence of passwords is growing. If you need more data, here's more data. Anybody who's in the consumer business, consumer digital business today, over 50% of the traffic hitting your websites are from credential stuffing attacks using this kind of technology today. If you were, let's say by chance you started a coffee shop that was wildly successful in Seattle a decade ago, and it turned into a franchise coffee shop that was known the world over with a great brand and a wonderful loyalty program. It turns out that 95% of the web traffic hitting that website is from credential stuffers. It's from criminals. So you think of a public company. Does anybody here work for a public company? Right. So you may end up today spending money on web servers to service 50% or more of the traffic that's coming from criminals. So economically, this makes no sense, right? And it's all fundamentally because of passwords. You see, we can't remember passwords. We have too many digital properties that require us to remember passwords. So what do? You guys do the same thing I do. You use the same password across one site or another site, or you decide you're not going to remember the password. You'll just do password reset every time that you need it. You make these trade-offs all the time. We have to. We all do. And that's what's giving the threat actors unencumbered access to our digital assets because there's no friction for them. Is there friction for us? I think yes. And it's remembering the password. Now, in order to solve this problem, we have to do something that's really hard. And this is something that the human brain wasn't really designed to do. We have to unlearn something. Now, would you agree that learning something fresh is easier than unlearning something? Would you agree? Yeah. So in this case, what we have to unlearn, and I have to ask everybody to try this, I want you to unlearn the definition of authentication. And the reason I want you to unlearn that is we were all taught the same thing. We were taught that authentication was an event. It had a beginning and an end and a binary outcome, just like that card key that you get from your hotel. We've all been trained that this is what authentication means. And when you get through that gauntlet of whatever you have as authentication controls, you're in. You're trusted. It's unfettered access. That's the way we've been taught historically. And frankly, the user ID and password has been a foundational item and component of that infrastructure. And today we use it across, for our own purposes internally and for all of our customers, for our enterprise assets. It's foundational. So what we're doing is we're adding additional factors into that event in the hope that we don't create too much friction for the consumer, but friction for the threat actor. And that's essentially what all of these are one-time binary events inside this authentication event. And let's face it, sooner or later it gets kind of silly. And so my premise and what I'm suggesting to you is I want you to unlearn this. Authentication is not an event with a beginning and an end and a binary outcome. Because when we think of authentication that way, it forces us in this paradigm, and all of us as security professionals have dealt with this. We have to make trade-off decisions. What's a trade-off decision? It's a decision when you can choose option A or option B, but either way, you have some negatives, pros and cons. So you have to make a trade-off decision between the two. We've all been in this situation. We have a new digital asset that the enterprise is going to provide to consumers. We want to make it as convenient as possible to improve the digital experience. So what we do is we look at the information classification of the app, and then we decide where on that spectrum is the optimal balance between friction for the end user and security on the other side. The higher the degree of sensitivity of the information, the more friction that we introduce. Our hope is that there's friction for the threat actor while we're screwing our customers. That's essentially what our hope is. And to me, this is not a tenable situation. And in order to get out of this situation, I have to ask you, please, close your eyes. Close your eyes. Trust. Nobody's going to move. Close your eyes just for 10 seconds and say, authentication is a continuous process with no beginning and no end. Authentication is a continuous process with no beginning and no end. Open your eyes and let's explore that. Because the more we think about authentication methods that are binary and fit them into that definition that we're trying to unlearn, the more we create friction for the consumer. Authentication is not an event. It's a continuous process. And it's based on a 4-letter word. It's based on math. Now, it's actually based on data science, but math is a 4-letter word, and that sounds better. Don't you agree? Yeah. So here's how way it works. You can actually have a better consumer digital experience with no friction, with better security, at lower cost. It's what I call a trifecta. But you have to be able to think about authentication as a continuous process that uses behavioral attributes in the background to create a confidence score based on how those attributes stack up and measure or compare to the baseline. So you establish a pattern of benign attributes that you capture, and then you measure the actual attributes against the benign pattern. You turn those into hashes or algorithms, numeric representation of reality or of an event, and then you create a confidence score. You aggregate that across multiple attributes, and you feed that into your app in real time, and your app decides how much access to provide and can react and respond to what you're doing online because it's a continuous process. So it turns out that the mobile device all of us use has a lot of attributes that are available. Now, you have to take a look at all of the attributes, and you have to squeeze them into the attributes that you're comfortable with from a privacy standpoint, because technology today has allowed enterprises and developers that develop mobile and web apps for the consumers to venture into the creepiness zone. The creepiness zone is where we capture through a mobile app your contact lists, and we compare it to your previous version the last time you logged in, and we say, this looks like it's the same person. That's creepy, right? And when you venture into creepiness, you lose all confidence with the consumers, and you deserve to. So you can't do what the technology allows you to do. You have to do a subset of that, and basically I call it benign attributes. And then turn those benign attributes into algorithms or hashes, and just do the comparison of a hash to a hash, and that gives you the deviation score that ultimately crosses all of the attributes you're using, and if you don't have some attributes, it doesn't matter, it's okay. You don't need them all. So you create one score, which is a confidence score, and that's what you feed to the app in real time. So what does the architecture look like? Well, the center of the universe is a risk engine. And the risk engine is where you take inputs from lots of different sources, internally and externally. If you can have a really strong identity proofing solution for the registration process, and then you create a behavioral pattern of a bunch of attributes for each individual user, and then you compare real-time interaction to that pattern, and you do that through, and you can make adjustments through policy orchestration. So that's essentially what the architecture is for what I'm building right now. And we're going to stay on this slide for a while because I think it's really important. The fact that my clicker's not working has nothing to do with the fact that I'm staying on this slide. Can you advance the slide? Otherwise, we're going to be here for a while. Oh, it's up here? Let me talk to the guy up here. How'd that work? Hey, great. Good thing that was my last slide. So the last thing is Phyto. Anybody heard of Phyto? Phyto Alliance? Yes? No? Yeah. 22.4%. OK. The Phyto Alliance basically says that when you, as a consumer, digital consumer, choose a device like this, you can also choose authentication or biometric capability that's on the device. So in this case, I have an iPhone, so I can choose Touch ID, or I can choose Touch ID and Face ID, if I'm a glutton for punishment. And that gives me some level of comfort. Now, I make that choice as a consumer, but I can feed that data from that choice of biometric into my risk engine and score it and weight that input using the Phyto standard. And that's, we're on Phyto 2 now. And that's across all the major manufacturers today. So if I'm developing a consumer app using continuous behavioral-based authentication, I'm going to want to use Phyto because then you, as a consumer, can make your choice, and I can support it. The rest of the continuous behavioral-based authentication happens in the background, and that's what makes such a valuable user experience, because you're removing the friction of having to remember a password. Why does it cost less money? How much money do you spend on password resets? The answer is millions of dollars if you're a large enterprise. Well, if you don't have passwords, do you have to spend money on password resets? No, yeah, I was waiting for the audience to catch up there. Yeah, no, you don't. It's money, it's savings, right? So whatever money you invest in putting this capability in place, you actually get it back in the savings year over year because you're not paying for password reset. So you're improving the digital experience, you're improving security, and you're delivering at a lower cost. Sound reasonable? That's all I have, and I can take a couple of questions. I think we have time, Ed, for a couple of questions. Is that right? And I'll prompt that with this. And I'll take jokes or comments either as well. Yeah, I got one over here. Yep, go ahead.
Why would you consider that authentication? It sounds more like artificial intelligence monitoring of behavior, similar to dark trace.
Yeah, I would, you call it that, and I'm all right with that. I have no problem. I don't call it that, I call it continuous behavioral-based authentication, but that sounds good to me because essentially that's what it is. But I broaden my definition of authentication because I think most of us get wrapped around the axle when we think about authentication as an individual event. And I can tell you, MassMutual implemented multi-factor authentication a year ago. We have 50% of our consumers and field using multi-factor authentication. What do you think the other 50% are doing? Nothing. They're sick and fed up with dealing with the website. Does that sound like that's the new standard, multi-factor authentication? I'm telling you, the user experience is, there's no one that's implemented multi-factor authentication with tremendous ease and without a lot of pain when it comes to the consumer. So I think this is a fundamental different alternative. I'm doing it. So I have 10 million users at Aetna using this technology in production today. They'll have 50 million by the end of next year, and I'm building this for MassMutual. We're a smaller company, so we'll have about 1 million users next year. And I'm doing it for internal use as well, so I'm all in and committed to it. But you can enjoy a cocktail and contemplate it, because you have that right? How are we doing, Ed, on time?
Fine.
Other questions? Is that a question?
How do you initiate?
Can you do some calisthenics, maybe jumping jacks while you're doing it? I know you could. You look like that type. Thank you. I appreciate standing up.
So how do you initiate this, right? Like you onboard a new employee, you onboard a new customer, you have no basis to start your hashes with. What's the, I'm sold. I'm all on board with the rest of the model, but where does it start?
Yeah, she's very sharp. She looked at that and she knew right away where the weakness of that architecture is. And it's in the registration process. And you're absolutely right, because in the registration process, do you have behavioral data that you can use? Not so much, right? Doesn't exist. And if you register a user, a consumer, and you map their behavioral patterns and it's not the consumer, Houston, we got a problem, right? So you're absolutely right. And therefore, to make this model work, you need identity proofing in the registration process. And I supplement that with third-party data from high-volume online transaction processing companies that share that data either through an intermediary or one-on-one. So I supplement that data before I have the behavioral patterns, because I'm in the life insurance company. How many people go to their life insurance website 100 times a year? I don't think so, right? Once. Yeah, only under duress, right? So what I'm trying to do is create some digital stickiness. I don't have it to adhere to, so I have to use third parties to do that. So third parties and identity proofing. Ori, do you know anybody in the identity proofing business? Can you help? There you go. There you go. There you go. There you go. Yeah. So you need that, and thank you for pointing that out. I didn't see the jumping jacks, so. Huh? Oh, you did. Oh, got it. Got it. When I was turned, okay, cool. Thank you very much. Ed, how are we doing on time?
One in the back.
Hey, isn't authentication just part of the problem? Isn't the real problem that there's so much privilege granted to users that don't really use all the privilege? And I say that selfishly because I work for a company that manages privilege creep. But isn't there this other side of the equation, or do you see it that way?
My perspective is privilege user management is a thing. Authentication is a thing. They're both continuous. Privilege user management is where, in my world, I have every registered user of the network that has a behavioral profile based on their attribute information, their entitlements, how they use their entitlements, their web browsing, their email, and their physical access. And that's built into every single user. So when a user requests privilege, the first thing I do is force them into the vaulting solution and get a password. The second thing I do is while they have that, let's say it's for 8 hours they have the privilege for, I monitor their behavior against the pattern. And if there's a slight deviation in the pattern, I send an email to their boss that says, Jim tried to get into this database at this point in time, which he's never done before. Is that okay or not? Now, why do I send it to their boss? Your boss should know what you're doing, how you're doing it, and when you're doing it. And by the way, no one in the SOC knows that. So sending this to the security operations team is like the dumbest thing in the world because nobody's going to pay attention to it. You send it to the boss knows, the boss says, green button, that's good. That means that feeds the model, and it's never alerted on going forward, so the model gets smarter. Red means automatic escalation into a security incident, and the privilege is revoked. If it's a significant deviation, then automatic privilege revoked in real time driven by the models, and a security incident is orchestrated. So to me, that's privileged user management, and authentication is this other. But just recognize that I'm creating my own definitions here. The industry is not warmed up to this. And frankly, I'm about to get something thrown at me if I continue this. But that's the game. Does that answer your question?
I think there's a hole, and I'll come up afterwards.
OK.
I still think there's a slight gap.
Ori, do you pay these guys to come up and use the microphone? Or on that? OK. OK. All right. All right. How are we doing, Ed, on time?
I'm going to do one more. There's a question over
Yep.
here. Can you speak to the authenticators that you had, which includes Pindrop, Phyto, Semperis?
Yeah.
Where and when? How do you use those?
Yeah. So the concept is this. Web, mobile, and voice. When you're a consumer and you're using your cell phone to go to their website and use the mobile app, and then you get frustrated and you call somebody on the phone, you want the same experience from an authentication perspective, regardless of the channel. You expect the enterprise to recognize you, right? So these are all examples of authenticators that we can use across all three major channels: web, mobile, and voice. So the authentication that happens to the IVR, it's using the same risk engine, which is fed by, in this case, both payphone and Pindrop. It's Pindrop Passport. So both of those are fed into the risk engine for that channel. But we're also using all the other attributes across the other channels to do that as well. And it's different for web versus mobile. So that's why it's like that. You've been a wonderful audience, and you get really high scores on your questions and your calisthenics on top. So thank you, and I hope this was helpful. Enjoy the rest of the resiliency sessions. I won't be here at the end. I have an important date with my boss. She's sitting back there, so I'm not able to do that afterwards. But you'll have a great panel to do. Ed, all yours, man.